Welcome to the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of RocketPD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
What are classrooms designed for? Classrooms have been with us in North America for about 170 years, right? They started at the dawn of public education at the end of the first industrial revolution, when the goals of education were conformity and compliance. That's what classrooms were designed for. Conformity and compliance. That's what they do well.
You're listening to Peter Liljedahl. Peter is the author of Building Thinking Classrooms, a book that has quite literally started a movement, the premise of which is simple. If we want students to learn, we must teach them not what to do, but how to think.
And what's changed? We're 170 years down the road. What has really changed in a classroom? Okay, so we've gone from blackboards to green boards to whiteboards to smart boards, and the chair's not always attached to the desk anymore. But what has really changed, right?
In this episode of the RocketPD Podcast, I talk with Peter about what a thinking classroom looks like, how it works, the years of research behind it, and the feeling that students and teachers get when they unlock the power of thinking through talking and teamwork in school.
Right? We're not talking about conformity and compliance so much anymore. We're talking about 21st century learning skills. We're talking about critical and creative thinking. We're talking about equity. We're talking about a whole bunch of different goals. There's no way we can achieve those goals in a setting that was designed for conformity and compliance. We need to change the environment.
Interested in learning more about thinking classrooms? Stick around until the end. Peter offers details about a group he's pulling together later this year, in which he'll walk you and other educators through a process to begin building your own thinking classroom. Hey, Peter, so great to have you. Before we kind of get into it, I wanted to relay a little story. I was up in Boston a couple weeks ago in the Harvard area, and I was meeting with a couple of guys that are old educators, veterans, and they spend a lot of time at Harvard, and they talk a lot about wanting to reinvent education, rethinking, the way that we do school reform and all of this stuff. And we were sat down, we were there for, 3-4 hours, and somehow your name came up. And before I know it, they're passing around the computer and showing YouTube videos of educators actually doing the thinking classrooms model in practice in their schools. And they're fascinated by the way the students are engaging. They're fascinated by the whiteboards and the way that they're talking. But what they were most fascinated by, and I thought this was hysterical, was what the teachers weren't saying. The fact that the teachers were resisting answering questions that the students had. And this just blew their minds. They talked about how hard this must be for the teachers to not want to answer questions. So I wanted to share that bit with you because it was great to see them literally passing the computer around the table and having that reaction and just kind of get your reaction to that.
Oh yeah, this is, well, first of all, nice story. That there's nothing quite like seeing a thinking classroom. I mean, it really it's got this sort of almost this sense that there's definitely something interesting going on here. The kids are definitely behaving differently than what we're used to seeing them. And then as you start to look deeper, you get past the obvious things. The kids are working at the whiteboards and so on and so forth. And when you start to think about, okay, what's a teacher doing here? Because we're looking at the kids and they're doing a lot of stuff. And what the teacher's doing is most easily described by what they're not doing, as you said. They're not answering questions. They're not lecturing at the front. They're not guiding too much. They are pushing in as needed, but for very short periods of time. They're dropping hints and moving on. And is it hard? Absolutely. Teachers enter the profession because they want to be helpful. And one of the things that we found in our research was you got to be careful with how much help you're offering, right? Because every time you give too much, you're sucking thinking out of that space and you're robbing students of opportunities to think. That doesn't mean you're absent. It doesn't mean you're absent. You're present. You've got proximity. You're listening. You're monitoring, and you are still active in that space. But less is more. Definitely less is more.
It was so cool to see that, just their reaction to it. And again, this idea that they at all thought this was novel. Again, these are folks who have been educators for 30, 40 years and spent the last 20 or 30 thinking about innovation and reinvention. And so to them, this was fascinating and fascinating to me too. And I'll tell you, there's been all this talk in education in the last couple of years, particularly since the pandemic, about this notion of students falling behind, particularly in mathematics. And often when I have conversations like that with folks, it comes down to a set of skills or testing scores that they need to raise in order to reach a certain benchmark. But when I read your book and I listen to the things that you've been saying online, it almost feels a bit like taking this thing down to the studs. It's less about the activities in the classroom, the things that kids do over and over again, and more about this bigger idea of thinking and how does thinking happen in a classroom. So let's talk about that a little bit, if we could.
Well, that certainly is the essence of thinking classrooms, right? Like I'm not saying skills aren't important. Skills are very important, but we have to recognize that skills are byproducts of a process, right? Like skills is what comes out at the back end. It's not what goes in at the front end, right? And we want students to master skills. We want them to remember things, but we want that to be an outcome of authentic engagement and thinking and so on and so forth. Because if we don't do that, right, if we don't focus on things like thinking, we can actually achieve skills without actually achieving learning and thinking and understanding and these sorts of things. So that's what building thinking classrooms is about. It's really just about exactly what you said. It's about how can we peel back education right to the studs, right? And it's a nice metaphor. We're going to go in, we're going to renovate this. We got to strip it away. We got to get through those 170 years of paint down to the gyprock. We got to strip that away. We got to go to the core of education, what our goals are. And, but we don't have to do anything that's like uber radical in the sense. I'm not saying like we have to tear down schools and build them in a different vision. All of our research was done inside of the four walls of a classroom on an existing bell schedule, right? Like we'll work inside the classroom. We're just going to do things different. And the reason we're doing things different is because the research showed that if we want students to think, it's impossible to ask them to do that in a setting that wasn't designed for thinking, right? What are classrooms designed for? Classrooms have been with us in North America for about 170 years, right? They started at the dawn of public education, at the end of the first industrial revolution, when the goals of education were conformity and compliance. That's what classrooms were designed for, conformity and compliance. That's what they do well. They do conformity and compliance really well, right? And what's changed? We're 170 years down the road. What has really changed in a classroom? Okay, so yeah, we've gone from blackboards to green boards to whiteboards to smart boards, and the chair's not always attached to the desk anymore. But what has really changed, right? Our goals have changed, right? We're not talking about conformity and compliance so much anymore. We're talking about 21st century learning skills. We're talking about critical and creative thinking. We're talking about equity. We're talking about a whole bunch of different goals. There's no way we can achieve those goals in a setting that was designed for conformity and compliance. We need to change the environment. And that's not why the environment looks different in a thinking classroom. That explains why an environment looks different in a thinking classroom. The research is why the environment looks different in a thinking classroom.
So let's talk a little bit about the difference between that old 150-year-old model and the model that you're developing, or the model that you're sharing through building thinking classrooms. How do those things look and feel different? And how do you know when you're in a thinking classroom environment versus sort of this archaic 150-year-old classroom environment?
Okay, well, I think the easiest way to answer that question is to describe what happens in a thinking classroom. So let's say you walked in and there was a thinking classroom. What are the things? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it smell like? Right? So if you're in a thinking classroom, let's say you're You walk in, it's already up and running. So what are you going to notice? The first thing you're going to notice is nobody's sitting down. All the students are on their feet. They're in groups of 3, and they're all working at some sort of a vertical whiteboard or a proxy for a vertical whiteboard. It just has to be vertical and erasable. So they could be working on a window. They could be working on a vinyl picnic table cover. They could be working on a shower board. They could be working on a whiteboard or some third-party or aftermarket product like Whitebook or Better Than Paper. They're working on something that is vertical and erasable. You'll notice that they're doing an awful lot of talking with each other. There's only one marker per group. That marker is moving around in that group. All of a sudden, you'll see a group pause and look around and see what another group is doing. They may go over and ask them what they're doing, bring back an idea, keep working. They're trying to figure their way forward. They're trying to solve a problem. If you're looking for the teacher, you'll see this teacher sort of flitting about, giving extensions, interjecting with hints, maybe circling something that they want them to look at a little bit more, constantly guiding, ever present, but not overly present. If you pay really close attention, you'll notice that there are ways in which the teacher is really seeding ideas here and there to make sure that powerful ideas are coming forward and pulling them forward and maybe pushing those ideas to another group by asking a group to look over here or asking a group to go over and talk to a group. If you talk to the kids and ask them how the groups were formed, they'll tell you that they were formed randomly, that at the beginning of the lesson, they pulled a card and the card told them who they were working with. If you happen to be there for the beginning of the lesson, you might see the teacher do a little bit of direct instruction if there is a new concept, something they've never seen before. Or you may see them just asking a thought-provoking question, or maybe mobilizing, activating some prior knowledge. Regardless of what they're doing, you'll notice that it's when they're giving this introduction to the lesson, the kids are all on their feet, they're huddled with the teacher. The teacher's taking less than 5 minutes from the moment they start talking about what's going to happen to the moment that the kids are at the whiteboards and they're thinking. And this is what the majority of the lesson is going to look like. If you stick around long enough, you'll see the teacher put together a really thoughtful closing to the lesson where they're not just summarizing what was learned, they're actually helping the students to organize, structure, and formalize their thoughts. They're helping them turn meaning making into meaning made. And, depending on how long you stick around for, you might actually see some assessment as well. This is what a thinking classroom looks like. Now, if you contrast that to what I call a normative classroom, it's very different. In a normative classroom, you come in at the 15-minute mark, odds are you're still seeing the teacher lecturing at the students about what today's lesson is about. The students might be writing notes at the front end of the lesson, whereas in a thinking classroom, they're writing them at the back end of the lesson. There's a lot of things that are happening in the classroom, in a normative classroom, that are in place of thinking, right? The students are writing notes rather than thinking. They're listening to the teacher rather than thinking. These are things that are not happening in a thinking classroom. So those are some of the big differences from a visual sort of sense space. And each of these things is mired in years of research that reveal that this is actually the best way to do this one thing, right? Like, what is the best way to make groups? Turns out it's random. Where's the best place for students to work? It turns out it's at a vertical whiteboard. What's the best way to launch a lesson? It turns out to have the kids on their feet in a huddle and being verbal as much as possible with visuals and models and demonstrations. And all of these things are empirically deduced.
I have to ask you one question, which is why only one marker? Because this is something when we watch the videos that everyone commented on. Hey, did you notice the students only have one marker?
Yeah. So, okay, we know, and we've known for a long time that collaboration is important. Right? And you can see that history of collaboration over the last 50 years, how it's become more and more important. Rarely do we ask why. So what is it about collaboration that is so valuable, right? Part of it is that it's a meaning-making space. It's a safe space. The kids are operating at the same register, so they're communicating really well. But what is it that collaboration really does that sitting and doing silent individual contemplation doesn't? What collaboration forces students to do is talk to each other. Now, why is talking so valuable? So let's do a little thought experiment. Not even a thought experiment. Let me just call you back to an experience that many teachers have had. Have you ever had that experience where a student puts up their hand and you walk over to them, and just as you get there, they go, yeah, never mind, I got it. Or they'll pick up their book and they'll walk over to you. They'll get right up to you and they'll look at you and they'll turn around and go back. And what is it that's happening in those moments? I tell students they're smarter when they're close to me. But what's really going on is that the students in the process of either having their hand up waiting for you to come to them or walking to you are starting to formalize their thoughts so that they can ask you a question. They're preparing to externalize their thinking. This is an incredibly metacognitive process. The externalization of thought requires students to organize and structure their thinking. Why do we want students talking to each other? Because it's incredibly metacognitive, right? Externalization of thought is a way of organizing and structuring our thoughts, and it makes our thinking better. We want kids talking to each other, right? That's what we want. That's what collaboration is about. So what if they all had a marker? If each student had a marker, there's a lot less talking, right? There's a lot less talking. See, collaboration is good in theory. We know it works, but it's not an innate quality, right? Like you have the wrong personalities in a group. They'd rather work on their own. You give them an opportunity to work on their own and they're going to fracture. You're not going to get that collaboration. You're not going to get that talking. One marker is what we call a forcing function. It forces collaboration, but we also can force it through other means, which is that, for example, one of the rules we'll set, we don't always do this, but we'll set a rule that you're never allowed to write your own ideas. So you can only write the ideas of others, which means if you have an idea, you got to pass the marker. And what's happening in this moment? You're talking to each other. And in the act of talking, you're being very metacognitive. But what's also happening is you're sharing all these ideas. You're mobilizing your knowledge. You're bringing others into that. And personally, one of the things that I think is most valuable, and it's a really small piece of the research, but I think it has really deep, deep implications, is there turns out to be a really big difference between what I call tentative knowledge and absolute knowledge. So I'm going to make two statements now, and you tell me which one is more inviting for you to contribute to. So this is how to do it. That's statement one. Statement two is, I think if we try this, it might work. Which one is more inviting?
Well, the I think statement, right? Because now I get to think back.
Mm-hmm. Because that's tentative knowledge.
Yeah.
It's hedging. I'm tentative with my ideas. I'm not sure. I'm not confident. I'm offering something. I'm taking a risk. It's very inviting. That's how kids talk to each other when they're in groups. They're not talking with absolute certainty. Who talks with absolute certainty? Teachers, right? When teachers are like, this is how we do it, it's not as inviting. It's not inviting to think about. It's not inviting to contribute to. But when a student goes, I'm not sure, but why don't we try this? Maybe this might work. It's going to say, another student's going to go, oh, let's try that. Oh, maybe we can try this, right? They want to contribute to that. And again, that only happens in collaboration, and it only happens if they're talking to each other.
So let me ask you this. Is this natural for teachers? I mean, you said 150 years, classrooms have been operating the same way. Essentially, education systems that are feeding schools have been operating the same way. I have seen, like I said, 100 videos at this point of this working and working super well. But I imagine what I'm watching is people who have been doing this for a little while. They're excited about it. They can't wait to share it. Mm-hmm. What about folks who are trying this for the first time, right?
So natural is an interesting word. So let's take a teacher, and there's many teachers who are listening to this podcast that are exactly like this, right? they're not happy with the kind of teacher that they were maybe trained to be. They're not happy with being the kind of teacher that they had as a teacher. They want to be different. They're on a journey to try to become a different type of teacher. They're not sure how to do it. They've abandoned a lot of ideas, but they haven't found new ideas that they want to move towards, right? And then they start doing this. It's very natural. It's very natural because it sort of fits a lot of the boxes that they're looking for. But even the teacher who just tries it because, seriously, that can't work. Let me give it a try. Even that teacher, the minute the kids erupt into this conversation, if you just stand back for a moment and look at what's happening, it starts to feel very natural very quickly because you're seeing the things that you've always wanted to try to create, but have never really been able to, right? Like how often do we hear teachers talking about, oh, the kids don't care. They're not curious. They're not even thinking it through the stuff. They're just there staying warm. They're breathing. Like how many times do we hear teachers talk about students being passive and yet the teachers want them to be active and all of a sudden they're seeing them being active and it's like, okay, this is, I want more of this.
So this almost in a way gives you the prompts, right? I mean, this is a way to kind of change. You're changing the way thinking happens in the classroom, but it also kind of changes your thinking as an educator a little bit.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things we saw in our data was that the teacher starts to make changes very naturally in this space. But part of it is because I think the research is just so grounded in practice, right? 400 teachers. That was just in the initial research. Since the book has been published, like think about the hundreds of thousands of teachers that are implementing around the world, right? And validating this on a day-to-day basis in those videos that you're seeing, in the videos that I'm seeing, in the messages I get, in the stories and the anecdotes and so on. Like it's being validated over and over and over again every day. But I think it's because it's really grounded in classroom, right? Like this is research that was done in classrooms with teachers, with real students in diverse settings, right? What works? And when you do that kind of research and you produce something that says this works, and then someone takes it and tries it with fidelity, guess what? It's going to work, right? And it's not going to work in the sense that there's lots of things that work, but they're really hard to do. Right? It doesn't take anything to make random groups and get them on the whiteboards and give them a thinking task. There's lots in the book. And you stand back and you're like, okay, this is working. I want more of this. Does that mean everything from this moment on is going to be a cakewalk? No. There are some really sophisticated practices that emerged out of this research. I've never claimed that building thinking classrooms is easy. I'm just claiming that building thinking classrooms will get your students thinking. And it will make you a more satisfied teacher. But there's going to be parts of it where you're going to go, okay, that was hard. I'm going to have to work on that. I had to really hold back there my temptation. I had to learn that I can trust the kids, and that was unnatural for me. And there are things that you're going to have to go against your intuitions. But you're going to get there.
So I've heard people say before, like when you want to do hard things, you kind of have to go through it. And this is a process of going through it to get to the other side. And that, to me, is really intriguing. I wanted to ask you, too.
Well, hold on. Before you ask that, you're absolutely right. But the benefit of BTC is it doesn't start hard, right? There's something about the research, because there was a huge amount of research put into what is the order we should implement in this in. Which are the practices that should come first that are good for students and good for teachers when we're first building this very unique space? It doesn't start hard. It turns out empirically, these are the practices that we should do first. It starts actually relatively easy. So you're going to get wins. You're going to get glimpses of what you want it to look like before you enter into that space where it's like, okay, I'm going to have to work a little harder here. So it's not that sort of blind devotion where it's like, okay, I'm just going to keep persisting on this. And I'm hoping one day, maybe in the future, at some point, I'm going to round this corner and it's going to start to pay off. No, like I see payoff on day one. Now I just want more payoff.
I love that. This notion that you can build over time, but you can start in a way that you have initial sort of confidence in this process. Because again, people have done this. You can go and watch it. You can see that it works. You can read the research and know, and then you feel good about starting. And to your point, being able to see these wins on day one, maybe the whole classroom doesn't transform right away, but just seeing students start to talk to one another and ask questions in a different way, I would think would get your mind kind of turning to say, all right, we're seeing something a little bit different here than we saw last week and the week before that.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. So let me ask you this: mathematics. Why start with mathematics? Because as I'm listening to you, what I hear are kind of universal, right? Like this could be applied in different situations as well, but you started with mathematics. I don't know if that's just because you're a mathematics guy at heart or what, but I'd love to hear the story.
So, yeah, the research was done, like I'm a former math teacher, right? Which is only partially true. I'm a former math, physics, English composition teacher, right? I taught high school in Vancouver, west coast of Canada. That's what I taught: math, physics, English composition. So, which is sort of an unusual mix, but I love teaching all of those. The research really started in mathematics. That sort of first journey into what is the problem was mathematics. However, about 50% of my participants were generalist teachers, middle school teachers, elementary teachers. What do you think they do when they find something that works in math? They apply it in social studies and science and language arts and art and PE, and they're doing it in everything. So there was, right from the start, there was data coming in that's going, hey, this works in other subjects. And of course it works in other subjects, right? Thinking is a necessary precursor to learning. If students are not thinking, they're not learning. We got to get them thinking. It doesn't matter what I'm teaching. I got to get them thinking. And many of these practices were absolutely universal. But I kept working inside of mathematics because in many ways, mathematics is different than other subjects, right? There's this real logical structure that really sort of screams a certain type of pedagogy. And part of me wanted to really upend that. Part of it was that I just loved mathematics. And once I started down that journey and we started seeing the benefits to mathematics, it was really enticing to keep going in there. When it came time to write the book, however, my editor and we spent significant time talking about, should I write the book for mathematics or for general pedagogy, for teaching across the curriculum, building thinking classrooms, no subtitle, right? Like just building thinking classrooms. And we settled on math because there was already a pretty significant movement of math teachers invested in building thinking classrooms. And I'm glad I did, because since the book has come out, the work on building thinking classrooms cross-curricular has really advanced. And I'm almost at the point now where I can write that book. Do I have time to write that book right now? No, but I'm almost at the point where I could write that book in terms of all the ideas are there. And the big transformation has happened in the last 14, 16 months, actually, when I stopped thinking about subjects and started thinking about learning activities. So the challenge was, I was like, okay, building thinking classrooms, language arts. I can do that. English language arts, I have a history in that. I see it really clearly. It's, English language arts is sort of a bifurcated curriculum. It's either reacting to text or creating text. Like that's sort of the two sides, and I can make both of those thinking activities. Someone says social studies. Okay, give me a minute. I got that. Yeah, got it. Here you go. Here's some ideas. AP Calc. Or AP psychology, sorry. And I'm like, all right, yeah, hold on just a minute. And then they're like, woodwork. And I'm like, just hold on, give me a minute. So like what was happening was, no matter what I was thinking about, there was always something I didn't have time to think about. Mm-hmm. And about 16 months ago, I sat down. I remember I was sitting down and I thought, there's got to be a better way to do this. Because as long as I keep treating subjects as completely unique from each other, this is an impossible task. So I started thinking about, like in a Venn diagram sense, what are these subjects? Like, what are they made up of? When we ask students to do something, because that's fundamentally what a thinking classroom is about. If we want students to think, we got to give them something to think about. And that comes in the form of a task. So let's look at the tasks, the learning activities we ask students to do in these different subjects. And it turns out that there's only really 7 learning activities that we ever ask students to do. And there's more of them in some subjects and less in others, right? And it's sort of like you can, and a subject is made up of some combination of these 7 learning activities. And then this becomes much easier, because now it's not building thinking classrooms as a subject. It's, what does building thinking classrooms look like with this type of learning activity? What does it look like with this type of learning activity? And then we can use those building blocks to build up whatever it is we teach.
Can I ask you what the 7 are? Do you have that on the tip of your tongue?
Oh, yeah, I got it. So number 1 is deductive. So deductive is what we see mostly in mathematics. Deductive is this idea that I have a little bit of knowledge, and then I can use deductive logic to expand that knowledge and be able to do more and more with it, right? That's math, right? If I know how to add fractions with common denominators, I can actually use some logic to get to different denominators and then mixed fractions and so on. Like, right? We start to see similarities. We're able to extend, extrapolate, and so on and so forth. That's number 1. We see this in math, parts of chemistry, a lot in physics, right? That sort of deductive exists in a lot of these are learning activities that exist across curriculum. The next one is analytic. So analytic is predominantly in the humanities. So analytics is, I'm going to give you a poem. I want you to analyze it. I want you to read this paragraph. I want you to analyze it. Analyze this short story, plot, theme, character development. I want you to look at these 3 historical documents, and let's take a look at if this character was a villain or a victim, right? We're going to look at historical documents from different times and different perspectives. We're going to look at a case in psychology, right? Like, this is analytic. We're looking at information and we're analyzing it, right? We see this in language arts. We see it, in fact, half of the language arts curriculum is analytic. We see it in social studies. Almost all of social studies is analytic. If we think about human social studies, human geography and stuff like that. When we get into physical geography and social studies and so on, it's a little bit different. But we see it in psychology, we see it in civics, we see it in law, we see it in lots of different courses. The next one is exploratory. So exploratory is actually very closely linked to analytic. The difference is that analytic, I'm going to give you the thing I want you to analyze. In exploratory, you got to go and get the thing that you're going to analyze. So maybe you're going to go and research and find those 3 historical documents. Maybe you're going to find that poem that you want to analyze. Maybe you're going to generate the data that you're going to analyze in science or in math even, because we have some of that exploratory in math as well. So exploratory activities are very closely linked to analytic, but they're a little different in that you gotta do a bit of front end work first. The 4th one is creative. So you're not going to analyze a poem. You're going to write a poem. You're not going to analyze a short story. You're going to write a short story, right? Like, there's the other 50% of language arts. Creative exists a lot in language arts, and also, of course, in the arts, but not so much the performing arts, at least not to begin with. The performing arts is more of what we call apprenticeship. So apprenticeship is like, okay, so if you're doing dance, you're not making up your own dance, usually not at the beginning. You're following a choreography, and there's somebody who is going to show you this choreography, and you're apprenticing under them. And we see apprenticeship in the performing arts. We see it in sport. Let me show you how to do a free throw. We see it in the technical subjects like foods and nutrition, textiles, woodwork, metalwork, right? We're working at the elbow of a master to learn some skills so that we, A, don't hurt ourselves, B, don't hurt somebody else, but also so that we can learn some of these things that we're never going to figure out on our own. We have to learn it, but it's not mimicking. So I talk a lot about mimicking in my book. And how is that different from mimicking if I'm showing you how to do it? Well, here's the difference. If I show you how to add fractions, you can mimic that and be successful within 5 minutes. If I show you how to do a golf swing, there's the next 20 years of your life trying to figure that out, right? This is apprenticeship. It takes coaching. It takes a different level of instruction. So far, all 5 of these are naturally thinking activities, right? Logic, deductive logic, analytic, exploratory, creative, apprenticeship. These are all inherently thinking activities. We gotta be careful not to suck the thinking out of it, which curriculum tends to do a lot because we don't trust kids and we overly prescribe rubrics and the way we want them to perform. We micromanage the way we want them to do things, and we're kind of sucking the thinking out of it. But the task at its core is a thinking activity. The 6th one is factual, right? Like there's things we got to learn that are just names, dates, places. There are a lot of nouns, right? And we see a lot of factual stuff in biology, history, earth science. Like we see a lot of factual. Factual doesn't start off as a thinking activity. It's the only one that is inherently not a thinking activity. We have to work really, really hard to turn it into a thinking activity. This is the one that took the longest for me to try to figure out. And there's some little techniques that we've developed. And there's one more, which is kind of on its own. So the first 6 are really clear. This last one is almost like practice 0. It's immersion. So immersive experiences as a way for students to learn is not so much present in education, but there's snippets of it here and there, but it exists more in a sort of natural education environment, right? So I'll give you an example. I have 3 kids, they're all grown up. They all like classic rock, right? How did that happen, right? Immersion into classic rock on all the drives to the cabin and so on and so forth, right? Like I didn't teach them classic rock. They were immersed in it, right? And it is a form of learning. I immigrated from Sweden when I was 8 years old to Canada. I was one of 3 immigrants in that school. I was immersed in culture and language. I couldn't help but learn, right? So immersion is still a very natural form of education, but it doesn't exist sort of formally in education in as many ways as would be good, but that's the 7th one.
So 7 groups of activities, 7 types of activities, group them together, and you really can start to take on this bigger idea of how do we apply the Thinking Classrooms model to all of these different topics. That's right. That's pretty cool. I would ask, getting back to this notion of, okay, I'm a teacher, I'm leaning, you can see me, I'm leaning right now. I'm very interested in these topics. If I'm a teacher and I'm interested in this, where's the best sort of place for me to start? I probably can't take on maybe all 7 of these things at once. Research, what do you find works, to kind of get going here?
Well, okay, so first of all, read the original book. Ignore the fact that it says mathematics in it. Read Building Thinking Classrooms. Put tape over the part that says in mathematics. Because there's 15 chapters in there. There's only really 2 that are very specific to mathematics. The rest are very generic, right? And you're going, yeah, I can apply this. This works. This makes sense, and so on and so forth. And the 2 chapters that are very specific to mathematics are Chapter 1 and Chapter 9. And this is where you would substitute out, like this is based on analytic ideas. How can I put in creative ideas in here? What would a creative activity look like? What would a sequence of creative activities look like? And that's sort of where this comes through. But the nice thing about it, if you read the book also gives you an implementation sort of schedule. Like this is how you start. This is what you do next. This is what you look for. And it'll help you build a thinking classroom. And you will get better. Your subject matter expertise will help you turn any subject into a thinking classroom, because you are still the expert on the subject and you're the expert on your context and the kids. So you just got to let that expertise come forward and meld with the building thinking classroom research, right? Building thinking classrooms is not a prescription. It is a framework. It needs your professional autonomy to make it work.
Let me ask you this. So, I've done this. I've implemented it. And I know you're a research guy, but I want to take the research hat off for a second and just talk about what the classroom feels like. How does it feel different now that we've done this? What am I seeing? What emotions exist? How does this look and feel when I've done it?
So, I described some of the feelings and sense of visual and auditory earlier, but what does it feel like? So, the first thing is you're going to feel this sense of accomplishment, because you're going to start to realize that, the purpose of teaching is not teaching, it's learning. And you're starting to see the learning. And you're starting to see that learning happening all around you. And you're starting to see the knowledge that's already in the room. So this idea that the smartest person in the room is the room. And you're starting to see this knowledge moving around the room. And this is also a very satisfying feeling. But I think that it's the small stories that make such a big difference. It's that student who comes to you and says, this is my favorite subject. Or the students who come into class today and say, are we doing the whiteboards today? Or the parent who sits down in front of you at parent-teacher interviews and goes, I don't know what you're doing in class, but my child can't stop talking about math. Or whatever it is you're teaching, right? They can't stop talking about what you're doing. And you're starting to realize that you're having that impact on students. That was the whole reason you decided to become a teacher, right? Like, we become teachers because we want to have impact on students. Then we get run over by the minutia of details and accountability and all of this stuff. But now all of a sudden I can start to feel this. I'm seeing smiles on kids' faces. They're starting to develop a passion for the subject that I have passion for, right? And what we see is massive improvements on student affect measures, but also massive improvement on teacher affect measures, on satisfaction as teachers, and so on and so forth.
Now, you're on a road show. I mean, I have a difficult time getting you on the phone, even for this interview. But if I'm an educator and, I'm not able to catch you at one of the districts that you're visiting this year, or one of the conferences you're giving, you're also pulling a group together this fall, a little bit later in the year. So tell me a little bit about that, what I can expect to see.
So for the last several years, it's been a road show, right? Like, I've been on tour, and the nice thing about that is I get to work with a lot of teachers who want to work with me. So like right now, I'm in Hartford, Connecticut. I worked with 60 teachers today who want to be here. Tomorrow I'm going to work with another 60 teachers, and it's great. But these 60 teachers are anchored in organizations, whether that's school districts or other structures, that are bringing me in and are saying, yeah, we want to make this move. We're committed to this. We're bringing you in, Peter. We're bringing all these teachers to you. They want to work with you. It's going to be good. And I've always loved that. But the person I've always worried about the most is a person who's sitting 3 counties over or 2 districts over or in a different state. And they're really passionate about this. They want to try it, but they're not in an organization that is either able or willing to bring me or one of my team members in to sort of create this. They are an island, or maybe there are 2 of them. There's 2 or 3, but their district doesn't have the resources or the will to scale this up. And so they're never going to have access to me in this way. So the great opportunity that we have coming forward is this RocketPD in the fall. It's synchronous, online, for the individual. It's for that teacher who wants to join and become part of a community of people coming in from all over the world. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the entire Building Thinking Classroom framework, not just the stuff that's in the main book, the Orange Book, because the research has moved on. You're going to get all the new stuff too, all the stuff that has developed since the book was published. So you're going to not just listen to me talk. You want to do that? Just go find a podcast. You're going to get to live it. It's going to be immersive, experiential, and we're going to be unpacking those experiences through the lens of Building Thinking Classrooms.
Well, this has been great, Peter. I want to thank you. For folks that are listening, if you're watching this video, as I said, I'll drop the link down below in the comments. If you're listening on a podcast channel and you want to learn more about what Peter's doing this fall, you can check that out at RocketPD.com. Peter, again, just want to say thank you for spending a little bit of time with us. Really appreciate it, and I hope to have you back again real soon.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
You got it. Thanks for listening to this episode of the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, consider clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. You can download the RocketPD Podcast wherever you find your favorite pods. We're also on YouTube. Just search for RocketPD. At RocketPD, we're on a mission to empower the world's teachers and staff. To learn more about our work and the community we're building together, visit us anytime at RocketPD.com. If you're an educator and you're listening to this, remember, your work matters. So be well, do right, and let's keep up the fight.